Following the surprise assault on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese A6m Zero, a groundbreaking technical feat, altered the public's image of Japanese technology. The Nimble fighter gained a legendary reputation very quickly, and the U.S. military rushed to keep up. The Zero was a seaborne aircraft that was superior than land warplanes and was intended to be launched by Japanese carriers. In an effort to understand the power and design of these devices, the U.S. tried to seize one. But before they risked being captured, the Japanese would crash their own planes because they were so protective of their technology. An airplane was flipped upside down on July 12, 1942, when a U.S. Navy patrol crew landed on the island of Akutan. The aircraft was undamaged and sent to the Naval Air Station in San Diego, California, where the A6m Zero's secrets were set to be revealed. Ancient Chinese biplanes were destroyed by the Mitsubishi A6m Zero, a modern Japanese fighter that U.S. intelligence found in 1940. Claire Lee Chenault and other experts cautioned the West about Japan's remarkable performance, comparing it to hawks in a chicken yard. These claims were disregarded by Americans, who thought their own technology was superior to that of the Japanese fighters. They didn't realize how powerful the machine was until the attack on Pearl Harbor. Chinese reports said that the Mitsubishi A6m Zero was a swift, agile, and outstanding machine. In dogfights, the Agile Zeros easily outmaneuvered other planes. Therefore, early U.S. confrontations with them frequently ended tragically. Japanese pilots, who had fought against China for years, were more experienced than U.S. pilots. The U.S. planes were frequently shot down because they were unable to outmaneuver the Japanese airplanes, although being somewhat quicker than the Agile Zeros. Using them against the Agile Zeros proved to be a challenge for British pilots accustomed to fighting German and Italian aircraft. Even though there were only 521 active Zeros in Japan at the time, their wide range made them appear to be present everywhere. For many years, there were rumors and conspiracy theories that the Zero was a Western design. Howard Hughes even went so far as to say that the Japanese Zero was a copy of the Hughes H-1 plane. The Zero's remarkable 12-to-1 air-to-air kill ratio against Allied aircraft in the early phases of World War II exceeded pre-war expectations of a 5-to-1 kill ratio. By diving into the Zeros from the clouds, shooting them, and then diving away, the Allies used boom and zoom techniques to counter this. Because the Zero couldn't keep up with American and British fighter planes during a dive, this tactic worked well against the Japanese juggernaut. But because the Allied pilots were trained to dogfight, this move was difficult, and some American commanders forced their pilots to keep dogfighting, which resulted in significant casualties. The Zero had serious defects that may have led to their demise if they were found. Therefore, their rule over the Pacific sky was short-lived. As it continued to occupy Asia without resistance, Japan hoped for a bloody but short conflict that would force the U.S. to ask for peace. Japanese pilots were told to crash or destroy their Zeros during the Pearl Harbor attack in order to prevent the Allies from seizing the technology. During the second wave of the operation, Zero pilot Shigenori Nishikaichi was struck by a P-36. He changed course to Niihau Island, the prearranged site for an emergency landing, after realizing how serious the situation was. But Japanese intelligence quickly discovered that the island was populated, despite their initial assumption to the contrary. Nishikaichi's face struck the instrument panel as he collided with a metal barrier. After locating the unconscious pilot, local resident Howard K. Leohano stole his paperwork and weapon. Unaware of the attack, the islanders escorted the pilot to his house. Keio Hanno summoned 3 pals, who were Japanese immigrants, to translate when contact became fruitless. The pilot told them about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the impending war, but they kept Keio Hanno and his wife in the dark. The Zero pilot and his Japanese friends posed a threat to Hawaiian pilot Keio Hanno. The Japanese immigrants assisted the pilot in his escape, while the islanders stationed guards to keep an eye on him. They used bribery to get Keio Hanno to surrender documents that included Japanese transmission codes and assault preparations for Pearl Harbor. But Nishikaichi realized he couldn't allow the Americans to take his plane and records. The pilot fled as the Japanese citizens played music on a gramophone. In a panic, the majority of the village's inhabitants fled to the caverns on the inner island for safety. Using the Zero's radio, the pilot and his friends tried to get in touch with the Japanese military. The Americans burned a warplane on fire after failing to learn its secrets. Then, threatening to deliver the documents, they kidnapped a married couple from the area. A vicious battle ensued when the husband tricked the Japanese soldiers and rescued his wife. Despite his injuries, the husband was saved by his wife. Although the plane was destroyed and its remnants were of little value, the records were turned over to the U.S. authorities. Japanese internment camps in the U.S. were justified by the Americans' belief that every Japanese immigrant was a potential agent as a result of the Niihau Island incident. The Japanese mounted a significant effort against the American outpost at Dutch Harbor in the Aleutians before to the Battle of Midway. A strike on the oil pipe caused Zero fighter pilot Petty Officer Tariyoshi Koga to land. On the island of Akutan, he thought he saw an open meadow, but it turned out to be a swamp. The cockpit slammed against the water when the Zero's wheel hit the water, flipping the plane over on its back. Koga Zero was mostly unharmed by the defeat. A U.S. Navy patrol team found an overturned Mitsubishi Zero in fine shape the following month. After being successfully rescued, the aircraft was sent to the Naval Air Station in San Diego, California, where it underwent repairs and was painted in the colors of the U.S. Navy. After that, the aircraft was put through a rigorous performance test and analyzed in a variety of settings. Luckily, the analysis found significant defects that would terminate the Zero's long-awaited dominance of the Pacific. The Zero's distinctive Japanese design, which prioritizes range, agility, and maneuverability over other factors, was evident in early tests. The intricacies of Jiro Horikoshi's invention were immediately clear to the Americans. The Royal Navy's senior naval test pilot, Captain Eric Brown, commended the Zero's turn rate. Up until the middle of 1943, the Zero was the best fighter in the world, capable flying 500 kilometers per hour and reaching elevations of over 10,000 meters. Its powerful weaponry included 2 20mm cannons and 2 77mm machine guns. Up until the middle of 1943, the Zero was in charge. Jiro Horikoshi's Zero fighter could travel more than 8 hours at cruising speed and 2 hours at top speed. Thin elliptical wings, soft rivets, and heat treatment for a whole metal construction were among its sophisticated aeronautic characteristics. At just 1.2 millimeters thick, the sheet metal covering the structure was lightweight, and the internal metal skeleton was perforated with circular holes for reduced weight. In addition to being 1,260 kilograms lighter than the American Wildcat, the Zero's design prioritized agility and speed above armor plate. It had hollow interior parts for floatability and a modest wingspan of 9 liters, making it ideal for seaborne usage. The U.S. military, however, took advantage of these shortcomings, underscoring the necessity for more sophisticated fighter aeronautic developments. Due to the Zero aircraft's lack of extra protection in the engine, fuel tank, and cockpit, American pilots observed that it would immediately catch fire or explode when it struck it. Pilots found it challenging to enter the aircraft without causing structural damage due to the thin sheet metal covering it. Horikoshi created button-activated grips and footholds to make it easier for pilots to enter the Zero without causing any damage. Despite being a swift and nimble aircraft, the American Zero's performance was hindered by its rigid and sluggish control surfaces. In order to keep the Zero lightweight, Horikoshi had to forego hydraulics, which made it less responsive while in flight. Due to a float carburetor problem, the engine, a Nakajima Sake with 1130 horsepower, flooded and shut down when the float valve opened during zero-G maneuvers. The Japanese Zero's slow performance, fast speed, fragility, and difficulty to maintain stability during zero-G maneuvers turned the tides on the Japanese fighter, even though the Allies were prepared to turn the tide on the Zero. The U.S.'s superior wartime industry and strategic resources, which enabled them to develop more potent aircraft, like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, short-lived the Zero's excellent performance against Allied airplanes during the Pacific War. Due to its limited production capacity and resources, Japan was unable to polish the Zero's shortcomings, including its stiff control surfaces and float carburetor. Despite its shortcomings, the light aircraft persisted in its battle. Additionally, Japan's remarkable pilot training program, which only produced about 100 strong pilots every few months, dashed their hopes of a short conflict. The skilled airmen who had decimated the Allies in the early months of the war were in short supply in Japan in 1942. American pilots were taught to spot Zeros fast and use certain maneuvers when flying at high speeds to prevent Japanese aircraft from being as agile at low speeds. They were limited to quick diving hit-and-run attacks and were not allowed to participate in dogfights. Allied pilots were aware of the Zero's vulnerability and lack of armor, and they understood that a single shot might eliminate them from the sky. Large numbers of Japanese Zeros were readily destroyed by Allied aircraft, and even the Wildcats were often shooting down A6Ms. The Zero was used as a kamikaze aircraft in early 1944 due to its unimpressive performance and the considerable territorial losses suffered by the Japanese. A more practical explanation is suggested by recent research, but others contend that Japanese troops were indoctrinated to serve their emperor. The Japanese determined that the destruction of major U.S. ships would be the most useful way to end their lives, since they had little time to train new pilots, and knew that most recruits would probably die in the hands of more seasoned friends. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi defended the Philippine Islands from Allied assaults in 1944 by using his fleet of Zeros as suicide planes. Putting a 250 kilograms bomb on a Zero and letting it crash into a U.S. ship was his plan to cripple it. Until the conclusion of the war, the Zeros and other Japanese airplanes that were unable to compete with Allied fighters were still deployed as kamikaze aircraft. Despite these last-ditch efforts, the most of them failed or were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire from the Allies. Nearly 400 American troops were killed, and the USS Bunker Hill was rendered inoperable when 2 Japanese pilots crashed their kamikaze Zeros onto the deck on May 11, 1945. Similar to Japan, the Mitsubishi Zero would finally be extinguished by the Allied powers after first appearing like a rising sun during World War II.